The city skyline was a necklace of cold, indifferent diamonds, flung across the velvet darkness. From his penthouse on the 92nd floor, Arthur Vance could see it all, yet he felt nothing. The view, which cost more than most people would earn in 100 lifetimes, was just glass and light, a sterile diorama of a world he no longer belonged to. His home was a testament to this detachment. It was a museum of grief, curated with minimalist precision. White walls, gray furniture, polished chrome that reflected a distorted, hollowed-out version of the man who lived there. There were no photographs, no clutter, no life. 5 years. It had been 5 years since the laughter had died, since the scent of Eleanor's perfume and the sound of little Thomas's feet pattering on hardwood had been stolen from him by the screech of tires on a rain-slicked road. Now, the only sound was the faint, electronic hum of a life support system for a man who was already gone. Arthur Vance, the titan of tech, the visionary CEO of Vance Innovations, was a ghost haunting the monument of his own success. His heart was a locked room, and he had long ago thrown away the key. Down below, in the canyons of steel and concrete he had helped to build, the pressure was mounting. Project Chimera, a revolutionary logistics algorithm, was supposed to be his magnum opus. It was a symphony of code designed to untangle the snarled arteries of global shipping, a project valued at a staggering $150 million. But the symphony was a cacophony. A single, fatal flaw was embedded deep within its core, a recursive loop that sent the entire system into a catastrophic spiral. For 3 weeks, the brightest minds in the country, lured to his company with promises of genius-level salaries and world-changing work, had been stumped. They had thrown everything at it: brute force computing, quantum modeling, sleepless nights fueled by caffeine and desperation. Nothing worked. The launch date loomed, and with every passing hour, the invisible weight on Arthur's shoulders grew heavier, threatening to crush the fragile shell of the man he pretended to be. Tonight, the pressure had become unbearable. The faces of his board members, a gallery of expectant, anxious predators, swam before his eyes. He had stormed out of the final emergency meeting, his voice a low growl of frustration that had left his top engineers flinching. He had grabbed his coat, a sleek black cashmere thing that felt like armor, and fled his own ivory tower. He didn't take the limo. He walked. He didn't know where he was going. He just needed to escape the suffocating silence of his penthouse and the deafening noise of his failure. The city air, thick with the smell of rain and exhaust, was a slap in the face. It was real. It was messy. It was everything his life was not. He pulled the collar of his coat tighter, his jaw set like granite, a solitary figure of immense wealth and profound poverty of spirit, walking aimlessly into the night. Meanwhile, in a corner of the city that the skyline mercilessly ignored, Sarah Jenkins was telling her son a story. Her voice was a soft, frayed thread in the cavernous, echoing space of the city shelter. They were huddled on a thin cot, a small island in a sea of quiet despair. Leo, her 7-year-old son, was curled against her side, his small body a warm, solid anchor in the churning chaos of her life. His eyes, wide and impossibly intelligent, were fixed on her face. He didn't just listen to her stories, he inhabited them. Sarah's stories weren't about dragons or castles. They were about brave little seeds that grew into tall trees, about lost stars that found their way back to their constellations. They were stories of hope, whispered like a prayer against the cold reality that surrounded them. Just that afternoon, that reality had grown colder. The manager at the cafe where she'd worked, a man with tired eyes and a forced smile, had called her into his office. The words were familiar, a sad refrain in a city that was constantly downsizing, streamlining, cutting away the margins. "I'm sorry, Sarah. It's not personal. We just can't." She hadn't even let him finish. She had simply nodded, her dignity a thin but resilient shield. She thanked him for the opportunity, collected the few dollars in her tip jar, and walked out, her head held high even as her stomach plummeted. Now, in the shelter, she held Leo tighter. He was the only thing that mattered. He was a miracle of a boy, a spark of brilliance in the encroaching dark. He saw the world in patterns, in numbers, in puzzles. He could solve complex Sudoku grids in the newspaper she salvaged from the bin, his brow furrowed in concentration. He would draw intricate mazes on scraps of paper, his logic flawless and intuitive. She nurtured this gift with everything she had, which was mostly love and library books. And the little star, she whispered, her breath warm against his hair, remembered that even in the biggest, darkest sky, its own light was enough. Leo looked up at her, his expression serious. But what if a storm comes, Mama? What if the clouds hide all the stars? Before she could answer, the world outside seemed to listen. A low rumble of thunder vibrated through the floor, and the high, grimy windows of the shelter were suddenly streaked with rain. A chaotic energy filled the room as people shuffled to secure their few belongings. The shelter had a strict curfew, one they had just missed by minutes while waiting in a line for a food voucher that never materialized. A stern-faced supervisor approached them. "I'm sorry, the doors are locked for the night. You know the rules." Sarah pleaded, her voice quiet but firm, pointing to her son. The supervisor just shook her head, her face a mask of practiced apathy. Rules are rules. And so they were outside. The rain wasn't a drizzle. It was a deluge, a cold, angry torrent that soaked them in seconds. The city lights blurred into a watercolor wash of neon and despair. Sarah wrapped her thin jacket around Leo, pulling him close, her own body taking the brunt of the downpour. They huddled in the recessed doorway of a towering glass skyscraper, the wind whipping around the corner like a hungry animal. Leo shivered, his teeth chattering. "I'm cold, Mama." "I know, sweet boy. I know. We'll find a place. Just a little longer," she soothed, her heart breaking with every shiver that racked his small frame. It was in this doorway, under the gleaming, impassive sign that read, Vance Innovations, that their world was about to collide with another. Arthur Vance didn't see them at first. He was lost in the labyrinth of his own mind, the flawed algorithm looping endlessly behind his eyes. He had stopped in the very same doorway, seeking a momentary reprieve from the biting wind, and pulled out his tablet. He had to look at it again. He had to find the flaw. The screen glowed, illuminating his grim face with its cold, blue light. A complex web of interconnected nodes and pathways filled the display, Project Chimera in all its beautiful, broken glory. He traced a line of code with his finger, his frustration mounting into a silent rage. It was perfect. It should work. Why didn't it work? That line is going the wrong way. The voice was small, clear, and so unexpected that Arthur flinched, nearly dropping the expensive device. He looked down. Peeking out from behind a woman's rain-soaked coat was a small boy, his dark hair plastered to his forehead, his eyes fixed on the tablet screen with an unnerving intensity. The woman, her face pale and strained in the ambient glow, pulled the boy back. "Leo, don't bother the man." "I'm so sorry, sir." Arthur barely heard her. He was staring at the boy. "What did you say?" he asked, his voice rougher than he intended. Leo, unafraid, pointed a small, trembling finger at the screen. "That one," he said, his finger hovering over a critical data transfer junction. "It's trying to go through the middle, but the gate is closed. It should go around. Here." With the simple, unhesitating logic of a child solving a maze, he traced an alternate route on the screen's surface, a path that bypassed the recursive bottleneck and reconnected to the main artery further down the line. It was elegant. It was simple. It was so blindingly obvious that for a moment, Arthur couldn't breathe. His engineers, with their PhDs and their complex theories, had been trying to force the gate open. They had been attacking the problem head-on, trying to rewrite the very laws of their digital universe. This child hadn't tried to break the wall. He had simply walked around it. Arthur's fingers flew across the screen, inputting the change. He ran a diagnostic simulation. Green. Across the board. Stable. Efficient. Perfect. A problem that had held a $150 million project hostage. A problem that had mystified a small army of geniuses had just been solved in seconds by a shivering, homeless child in a rain-swept alley. The shock was a physical blow. It knocked the air from his lungs and left him reeling. The world tilted on its axis. He looked from the glowing green check marks on his screen to the boy, then to the woman who held him. He saw their tattered sneakers, soaked through. He saw the way the woman's arms were wrapped protectively around the child, her own body a shield against the cold. He saw the exhaustion and fear in her eyes, but underneath it, a fierce, unbreakable dignity. His mind, trained to calculate value and mitigate risk, scrambled for a response. He did the only thing a man like him knew how to do. He reached into his coat, pulled out a thick leather wallet, and extracted a wad of cash. All of it. Several $1,000s. Here, he said, his voice strained. Take this. For your help. Sarah stared at the money in the man's outstretched hand. It was a thick, obscene stack of $100 bills, more money than she had seen in her entire life. For a fleeting second, a wave of desperate relief washed over her. It could mean a warm motel room, hot food, new shoes for Leo. It could mean a reprieve. But then she looked at the man's face. He wasn't looking at her, not really. He was looking through her, his expression a mixture of shock and something else, a frantic need to balance a ledger, to close a transaction. He saw them not as people, but as a problem that could be solved with cash. The spark of relief died, replaced by a familiar, steely pride. She gently pushed Leo behind her, her body a barrier. No, thank you, she said, her voice quiet but firm as a rock. Arthur blinked, genuinely confused. He wasn't used to being refused. He wasn't used to anything in his life that couldn't be bought, sold, or acquired. I insist, he said, pushing the money forward again. Your son, he did something remarkable. This is a finder's fee. He's a child, not an employee, Sarah countered, her chin lifting. He saw a puzzle, and he helped. We don't need a reward for that. We don't take pity. The word hung in the air between them, sharp and accusatory. Pity. It was a word Arthur hadn't considered. Was that what it was? Or was it shock? Gratitude? He didn't know. The clean, simple lines of his world had been smudged. For the first time in 5 years, he was faced with an equation that had no simple, monetary solution. He looked at them again, and this time, he really looked. He saw the dark circles under the woman's eyes, the fierce love with which she held her son. He saw the boy's intelligent, curious gaze, completely devoid of greed or expectation. They were not a problem to be solved. They were people. The rain was still coming down, and the boy shivered again, a violent, full-body tremor. An idea, foreign and impractical, sparked in Arthur's mind. The rain is getting worse, he said, changing tactics. His voice softened, losing its corporate edge. My office is in this building. The cafeteria is empty and warm for the night. There's a kitchen, sofas. No one will be there. You could stay, just until the storm passes. He was framing it as a practical solution, a logical course of action. It felt safer than offering help, less like charity. Sarah hesitated. Her pride warred with her maternal instinct. Leo was cold. He was starting to cough. The thought of a warm, dry room was an almost painful temptation. She looked at the man. His eyes, which had seemed so cold and distant before, now held a glimmer of something else. Uncertainty. Maybe even sincerity. We won't be any trouble, she said, the words tasting like surrender and salvation all at once. You won't be, Arthur replied, a hint of a smile touching his lips for the first time. It felt like a foreign muscle twitching. He led them through a side entrance, using a key card that beeped with quiet authority. The lobby was a cathedral of marble and steel, silent and imposing. Sarah and Leo looked around, their wet sneakers squeaking on the polished floor, making them feel small and out of place. Arthur didn't take them to the main cafeteria. Instead, he led them to a smaller, more private executive lounge on a deserted floor. It was still opulent, with plush leather sofas and a state-of-the-art kitchenette, but it felt more contained, less intimidating. He flicked on the lights, and the room was filled with a soft, warm glow. There's a shower through there, he said, pointing to a door. Towels should be in the cabinet. The fridge is stocked with drinks. Make yourselves at home. He felt awkward, a stranger in his own domain. He, a man who commanded boardrooms and moved markets, had no idea how to interact with a woman and child who had nothing. Sarah nodded, her gratitude palpable but unspoken. She took Leo towards the bathroom, her hand resting on his small back. Arthur stood alone in the lounge, the silence pressing in on him. He could hear the faint sound of the shower running. He looked around the room, at the wet footprints on the expensive rug, at the crumpled bag of belongings Sarah had placed carefully by a chair. It was an intrusion, a disruption of the sterile order of his life. And yet, for the first time in a very long time, the silence didn't feel empty. It felt expectant. A little while later, Sarah and Leo emerged. Leo was wearing an oversized t-shirt from a company fun run that Arthur had found in a locker, the Vance Innovations 5K logo hanging down to his knees. His hair was fluffy and dry, and his cheeks were pink. Sarah had washed her face and tied back her damp hair. She looked tired, but the raw edge of desperation was gone. Leo walked over to Arthur, who was still standing stiffly by the window. "Thank you, mister," he said, his voice clear and direct. "It's warm in here." "You're welcome," Arthur replied, the words feeling inadequate. He crouched down slightly, trying to meet the boy's eye level. "My name is Art," he said, omitting his last name. It felt simpler, safer. "I'm Leo, and that's my mom, Sarah." Arthur looked at Sarah, and she gave him a small, grateful smile. In that moment, surrounded by the trappings of his immense wealth, Arthur Vance felt a flicker of something he had long forgotten. A connection. It was faint, fragile, and utterly terrifying. The next morning, Arthur woke up on the uncomfortable sofa in his own office, a crick in his neck. He hadn't been able to bring himself to go back to his empty penthouse. He had stayed, listening to the quiet sounds of two other human beings breathing in the building. It was a profoundly unsettling and yet strangely comforting experience. He went down to the executive lounge. Sarah and Leo were already awake. The space was miraculously tidy, the towels they had used folded neatly on a chair. Sarah was wiping down the counter in the kitchenette, leaving the space cleaner than she had found it. Leo was sitting at a large mahogany table, drawing on the back of a discarded printout with a pen he'd found. Arthur cleared his throat. "Good morning." Sarah turned, a little startled. "Good morning, Art. We were just about to leave. Thank you again for everything." "There's no rush," Arthur said quickly, an unfamiliar panic rising in his chest at the thought of them disappearing back into the city. "There's a bakery downstairs. Let me get you some breakfast. As a thank you." It was a clumsy excuse, but it was the best he could come up with. Sarah hesitated, but Leo's eyes lit up at the mention of a bakery. "Can we, Mama? Please?" Her resolve crumbled under the weight of her son's simple desire. Over pastries and hot chocolate in the gleaming, empty cafeteria, an awkward sort of conversation began. Arthur, who usually spoke in terms of acquisitions and quarterly reports, found himself asking about Leo's favorite subjects in school, which he wasn't currently attending, and what kind of stories Sarah liked to read. He learned that Leo devoured books about science and space, and that Sarah had a soft spot for old black and white movies. They learned nothing about him, except that he worked in a boring office, and his name was Art. He was a blank slate, a man without a past. As they were about to leave, Arthur had another idea. "I have something for you, Leo," he said. He took them up to his office, a vast, corner suite with a view that made Sarah gasp. He ignored her awe and walked to a shelf behind his desk. It was the only personal item in the entire room, a beautifully crafted, intricate wooden puzzle box. It had been a gift from Eleanor. He had never been able to solve it. He handed it to Leo. "It's a puzzle," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. "I think you might like it." Leo took the box with a reverence that touched Arthur deeply. He sat on the floor, turning it over and over in his small hands, his brow furrowed in concentration. Sarah watched, a worried line between her brows. "Art, you shouldn't. That looks expensive." "It's meant to be solved," Arthur said, his eyes fixed on the boy. "It's been sitting on that shelf for years." Within 10 minutes, there was a series of soft clicks. Leo looked up, a triumphant grin on his face, and held out the open box. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was a small, silver locket. Arthur stared, his breath catching in his throat. He had forgotten it was even in there. He hadn't seen it in 5 years. This small boy had unlocked a piece of his past that he had sealed away. This became the new pattern of their lives. Arthur, under the guise of Art, the mid-level manager, would find reasons to see them. He arranged for them to stay in a small and used corporate apartment. "It's for visiting executives, but it's empty for a few weeks," he'd lied, ensuring they had a safe, stable place to sleep. He would show up in the evenings, bringing not charity, but challenges for Leo. A complex model rocket, a book on cryptography, a vintage erector set he'd bought online. Each time, Leo would master it with a quiet, joyful focus. But it was Sarah who began to slowly dismantle the walls around Arthur's heart. She didn't pry or ask questions. She simply existed in his space with a quiet grace that was both calming and revolutionary. One evening, he arrived late, exhausted from a grueling day of meetings about the successful Chimera rollout. He hadn't eaten. The corporate apartment smelled of garlic and tomatoes. Sarah was in the small kitchen, making a simple pasta with sauce. "You look tired," she said, her observation gentle, not accusatory. "Sit down. There's plenty." He sat at the small kitchen table, a piece of furniture that probably cost less than his shoes, and she placed a plate of spaghetti in front of him. It wasn't gourmet. It wasn't presented with a flourish. It was just food, offered with simple kindness. As he ate, a profound sense of peace settled over him. He was so used to the grand, empty gestures of his world, the Michelin-starred restaurants, the catered galas, the business dinners where every bite was a negotiation. This simple meal, this moment of unadorned human connection, felt more nourishing than anything he had experienced in years. He watched as Sarah helped Leo with a stubborn knot in his shoelace, her patience seemingly infinite. He saw the easy affection between them, the unspoken language of love and trust. It was a window into a world he had lost, a world he never thought he would see again. And in that small, borrowed kitchen, the ghost of Arthur Vance began to feel the faint, stirring pulse of life returning to his veins. The fragile piece of their new routine was a delicate blossom in the concrete jungle of Arthur's life, and he found himself tending to it with a care he hadn't known he possessed. The alias of Art was a relief, a liberation from the crushing weight of being Vance. As Art, he could simply be a man enjoying the company of a kind woman and a brilliant child. One Saturday, the sun finally broke through the city's perpetual gray haze, drenching the world in a warm, golden light. On a whim, Arthur suggested a trip to the park. The word hung in the air, heavy with unspoken history. He hadn't been to a park since before. Central Park had been their place. His, Eleanor's, and Thomas's. They would spend entire Sundays there, Thomas's delighted shrieks echoing as Arthur pushed him on the swings, Eleanor smiling from a nearby bench, a book resting in her lap. The memory was a sharp, physical pain. But then he looked at Leo, whose face was alight with the pure, unadulterated joy that only a child can feel at the prospect of grass and open sky. He couldn't say no. As they walked through the park's entrance, Arthur felt a wave of dizziness. Every corner held a ghost. The carousel they'd ridden, the vendor where they'd bought pretzels, the great lawn where Thomas had taken his first wobbly steps. He felt his chest tighten, the air growing thin. Sarah, with her uncanny emotional intelligence, seemed to sense his distress. She didn't ask what was wrong. She simply laid a gentle hand on his arm. "It's a beautiful day," she said softly, her voice a calming anchor. "Look, Leo wants to feed the ducks." The simple directive broke the spell. He followed her gaze to the pond, where Leo was watching the ducks with rapt attention. They bought a bag of stale bread from a vendor, and Arthur found himself kneeling beside Leo at the water's edge, tearing off pieces and watching the boy's face light up with each greedy quack from the flock. For a moment, watching Leo's uninhibited delight, the ghost of another small boy, another happy memory, didn't hurt. It was just there, a sad, sweet echo. Later, they sat on a bench under the shade of a large oak tree while Leo chased pigeons nearby. The silence between them was comfortable, companionable. Arthur found himself wanting to fill it, not with small talk, but with the truth. It was a terrifying impulse. He had guarded his story like a dragon hoarding its treasure, letting no one near the source of his pain. But Sarah was different. She didn't demand anything from him. Her quiet presence was an invitation, not an interrogation. He reached into his wallet, his fingers trembling slightly, and pulled out the small, worn photograph he carried everywhere. It was the only picture he allowed himself, his private penance. He held it out to her. I had a family," he said, the words rusty from disuse. Sarah took the photograph gently. In it, a younger, smiling Arthur stood with his arm around a beautiful woman with kind, laughing eyes. In front of them, perched on Arthur's shoulders, was a little boy with a mischievous grin and a shock of unruly dark hair. The resemblance to Leo was faint, but it was there. "This is Eleanor," Arthur said, his voice barely a whisper. "My wife. And this is Thomas, my son." Sarah looked from the photograph to his face, and her expression was one of such profound, heartbreaking empathy that it cracked something open inside him. She didn't offer platitudes, or empty condolences. She just looked at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears, and acknowledged his pain. "They're beautiful," she said softly. "He has your smile, Thomas." Arthur had to look away, a raw, burning sensation behind his eyes. "There was an accident," he continued, the words coming out in a halting rush. "5 years ago. A drunk driver. I was in a meeting overseas. I wasn't there." The guilt, the constant, corrosive companion of his grief, flooded him. "I should have been there." "Oh, Art," she whispered, her voice full of a sorrow that was not her own, but which she carried for him in that moment. She placed her hand over his on the bench, her touch warm and solid. "That's a weight no one should have to carry alone." He didn't pull away. For the first time since the accident, he allowed someone else to touch his grief. He didn't speak for a long time, just sat there, feeling the warmth of her hand, watching her son play in the sunlight. In that moment, he wasn't a billionaire CEO. He wasn't a failure or a success. He was just a man, broken and grieving, who had finally found a safe harbor in the quiet kindness of a woman who thought he was just a simple office worker named Art. The secret of his wealth, of his true identity, felt like a chasm between them. But as he looked at her, at the genuine compassion in her eyes, he realized the greater deception was the one he had been playing on himself, the lie that he was better off alone, that his heart was beyond repair. As Leo ran back to them, his face flushed and happy, holding up a lopsided daisy he'd picked, Arthur felt a dangerous, terrifying, and wonderful emotion take root in the barren soil of his heart. It was hope. The quiet, domestic world Arthur was building with Sarah and Leo was a secret garden, a fragile ecosystem that couldn't possibly survive exposure to the harsh climate of his public life. He knew this, but he pushed the thought away, choosing to live in the precious, sunlit moments they shared. But the world has a way of finding you, no matter how high you build your walls. At Vance Innovations, whispers had begun to circulate. The CEO, once a man who seemed to live and breathe for the company, was now distracted. He left meetings early. He was seen smiling at his phone. He had a different air about him, a lightness that was both foreign and, to some, suspicious. One of those suspicious people was Marcus Thorne, an executive vice president with sharp suits and an even sharper ambition. Marcus had been positioning himself for years as Arthur's heir apparent, mimicking his ruthlessness but possessing none of his vision. He saw Arthur's newfound distraction not as a sign of healing, but as a weakness to be exploited. He resented the praise Arthur had received for the miraculous turnaround on Project Chimera, a success for which Arthur had given a vague, unsatisfactory explanation. Marcus felt his own position, his own carefully constructed ascent, was threatened. He decided to dig. It didn't take much. A discreetly hired private investigator, a few well-placed $100 bills. The report landed on Marcus's desk a week later, a thin manila folder filled with dynamite. The photos were grainy, taken from a distance, but their meaning was unmistakable. There was Arthur, Arthur Vance, entering a modest corporate apartment building with a woman and a small child. There they were, sitting on a park bench, looking for all the world like a family. The woman was identified as Sarah Jenkins. Unemployed. Last known address, a city homeless shelter. Marcus leaned back in his leather chair, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face. It was perfect, better than he could have imagined. It was a story that wrote itself, a narrative of scandal and exploitation that the tabloids would devour. He made a call to a contact at a notoriously unscrupulous online gossip rag, feeding the reporter a carefully curated version of the story. He painted a picture of a grieving, vulnerable billionaire, his judgment clouded by loss, being taken advantage of by a cunning, destitute woman using her child as bait. He framed it as a tragedy, a cautionary tale, all while knowing it was a hit job. The story broke on a Tuesday morning. The headline was a digital scream. Grieving CEO Vance's secret family. Billionaire preyed upon by homeless grifter? The article was a masterpiece of insinuation and character assassination. It used the word vulnerable to describe Arthur and scheming to describe Sarah. It mentioned Leo, referring to him as the child, a pawn in his mother's alleged game. The story spread like wildfire. It was picked up by mainstream news outlets, hungry for a story that combined wealth, tragedy, and scandal. The company's stock, which had soared after the Chimera's success, took an immediate, sharp dive. The board of directors was in an emergency session within hours. The carefully constructed world of Arthur Vance, both public and private, had just been blown apart. Sarah saw it on a newsstand television while she was out buying groceries. She saw her own face, a candid shot from the park, splashed across the screen next to a picture of Arthur in a tuxedo. Arthur Vance, the reporter was saying, the reclusive CEO of Vance Innovations. The name hit her like a physical blow. Vance. Vance Innovations. The sign on the building. The logo on the t-shirt Leo was wearing. Arthur Vance. It all clicked into place with a sickening finality. The kindness, the apartment, the gifts, they weren't from a mid-level manager. They were from a billionaire. And the world, their world, thought she was a gold digger. Humiliation washed over her, hot and suffocating. She felt the stares of people on the street, people who had seen the news. Were they looking at her? Did they recognize her? She fled back to the apartment, her heart pounding. The foundation of trust she had built with Art had crumbled into dust, revealing a lie of staggering proportions. He hadn't just omitted his last name. He had hidden his entire world from her. She looked around the small apartment, which had felt like a sanctuary. Now it felt like a cage, a gilded cage she had been too naive to recognize. She had to get Leo. She had to leave, before they could be humiliated further, before the man she had started to care for, the man who didn't even exist, could hurt them anymore. Arthur was in the boardroom when the news broke. His phone had started buzzing incessantly, but he'd ignored it, trying to focus on a presentation about quarterly earnings. Then his assistant had burst in, her face pale, holding a tablet with the offending article displayed. A tomb-like silence fell over the room as the board members read the headline. The air crackled with panic and accusation. Marcus Thorne sat at the far end of the table, his face a perfect mask of feigned concern. "This is a catastrophe, Arthur," one of the older board members, a man named Henderson, said, his voice trembling with fury. "Our stock is in freefall. Your personal life is dragging the entire company down with it. You have to issue a statement. You have to distance yourself from this woman. Immediately." Arthur wasn't listening. He was staring at the photo of Sarah and Leo in the park. The moment that had felt so pure, so real, had been twisted into something ugly and transactional. They had taken her dignity and smeared it across the internet for clicks. And it was his fault. His secret, his lie, had exposed them to this. A cold, protective fury he hadn't felt in years surged through him. "The meeting is over," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. He stood up and walked out of the room, ignoring the cacophony of protests behind him. He had to get to Sarah. He had to explain. He raced to the corporate apartment, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He found it in disarray. A small suitcase was open on the bed, clothes hastily thrown inside. Sarah was standing in the middle of the room, her back to him. She was trembling. "Sarah," he said, his voice pleading. She turned around slowly. Her face was pale, her eyes filled with a pain and betrayal that was 1,000 times worse than the board's anger. "Vance," she said, the name sounding like poison on her tongue. "Your name is Arthur Vance. I was going to tell you," he started, taking a step towards her. "When? After you got tired of the social experiment?" She shot back, her voice laced with a bitterness that stunned him. "Was it amusing for you? Watching the poor woman and her child, so grateful for your billionaire crumbs? Did we make you feel better about your sad, empty life?" Each word was a perfectly aimed dart, and they all hit their mark. Because on some level, in the very beginning, hadn't that been part of it? Hadn't their authenticity been a balm for his own artificial existence? "No," he said, his voice raw. "No, it was never like that. It became real. You and Leo, you're real. The only real thing in my life. We're a liability to you now," she said, gesturing vaguely towards the window, towards the world outside that was judging them. "I saw the news. I know what they're saying about me. I will not be your scandal, Arthur. Leo and I, we'll be gone. We'll disappear. You can go back to your life, and everyone will forget this ever happened." She was trying to protect him. Even now, after he had lied to her, after his world had crashed down on hers, her first instinct was to shield him from the fallout. That realization broke through his panic and his guilt. It clarified everything. "No," he said, his voice firm now. He crossed the room and gently took her by the arms. She flinched but didn't pull away. You're not going anywhere. I lied to you, Sarah. I was a coward. I was afraid of letting anyone into my life. And I was afraid of what you would think if you knew the truth. I am so sorry. But I am not sorry that I met you. You and Leo, you didn't save my company. You saved me. Leo came out of the bedroom then, his face etched with confusion. He was holding the wooden puzzle box. Are we leaving, Mama? Is Art mad at us? Arthur knelt, so he was on eye level with the boy. No, Leo. I'm not mad. And my name is Arthur. I was just scared. But I'm not scared anymore. And we're not going anywhere. We're going to fix this. Together. But I need you to trust me. Both of you. Can you do that? He looked from Leo's worried face to Sarah's tear-streaked one. He was laying his broken, guarded heart bare. It was the biggest risk he had ever taken, bigger than any corporate merger or stock market gamble. Sarah looked at him, really looked at him, for a long, silent moment. She saw past the billionaire, past the lie. She saw the grieving man from the park bench, the man who had looked at a photo of his lost son with unbearable sadness. She saw the sincerity in his eyes now, the raw, desperate plea. Slowly, she nodded. Okay, Arthur, she whispered. We trust you. The next morning, an emergency board meeting was called. The atmosphere in the 30th floor boardroom was funereal. The long, polished table reflected the grim faces of the dozen men and women who held the fate of Vance Innovations in their hands. They were here for one reason: damage control. They expected Arthur to be contrite, to offer a public relations strategy that involved cutting all ties with Sarah Jenkins, perhaps even a quiet settlement to make her disappear. They were waiting for him to sacrifice her for the good of the company. Marcus Thorne was practically glowing with anticipation. He had positioned himself as the voice of reason in the crisis, counseling a swift and brutal severing of the connection. He was already imagining his own ascent in the wake of Arthur's public humbling. The doors to the boardroom opened. Arthur Vance walked in. He was not alone. Holding his right hand was Sarah Jenkins, her expression nervous but resolute. Holding his left hand was Leo, who looked around the cavernous room with wide, curious eyes. A collective gasp went through the room. It was an act of such audacious defiance that no one knew how to react. Henderson, the senior board member, found his voice first. Arthur, what is the meaning of this? This is a private meeting. Arthur didn't answer him. He walked to the head of the table, Sarah and Leo still flanking him. A small, united front against a room full of power and judgment. He looked at the faces around the table, his gaze finally landing on Marcus Thorne, who now looked distinctly ill. Ladies and gentlemen, Arthur began, his voice calm and clear, resonating with an authority no one had heard from him in years. You are all here today because you are worried. You're worried about the stock price, about public perception, about the stability of this company. You've read the headlines. You've seen the pictures. And you have drawn your own conclusions. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. Now, I'm going to tell you the truth. He turned slightly, his hand resting on Leo's shoulder. This is Leo. A few weeks ago, when Project Chimera was on the verge of collapse, costing this company millions of dollars a day, when our best and brightest engineers were completely stumped, Leo solved it. A ripple of disbelief and confusion went through the room. Marcus Thorne scoffed audibly. That's absurd. Is it, Marcus? Arthur's eyes were like chips of ice. He saw the flaw in the logic, a simple, elegant solution that everyone else had missed because they were too busy being brilliant. He didn't ask for a reward. He didn't ask for anything. He just saw a puzzle, and he fixed it. This boy, with nothing to his name, saved this company $150 million. He then turned his gaze to Sarah, his expression softening. And this is his mother, Sarah, the woman the media has so eagerly labeled a grifter. For the past few weeks, she has shown me more about integrity, dignity, and kindness than I have learned in my entire life. She thought I was a mid-level manager. She asked for nothing. She offered me her kindness when I had forgotten what it felt like. She taught me how to be human again. He let go of their hands and stood tall, facing the board directly. I did not tell her who I was. That was my lie, my cowardice, and my mistake. And it is my mistake that has exposed her and her son to this vicious, public attack. I will not have them pay the price for my fear. He took a deep breath. The story is that this woman and her child took advantage of me. The truth is, they saved me. They saved me from an empty life, and a hollow heart. They reminded me of what this company, what I, should be about. Not just innovation and profit, but humanity. Then came the final blow. Therefore, effective immediately, I am announcing the formation of the Vance Foundation for Family Opportunity. Its initial endowment will be $200 million of my personal shares in this company. Stunned silence. Its mission will be to provide housing, education, and support for homeless families across this country. And its first director will be Sarah Jenkins. He looked directly at Sarah, who was staring at him, her eyes wide with shock and tears. She has the integrity, the compassion, and the first-hand experience to ensure this foundation makes a real difference. And Leo will have a permanent scholarship to any school or university of his choosing, to nurture the brilliant mind that has already given this company so much. He turned back to the stun board. This is my decision. It is not up for debate. Sarah and Leo are my family now. They are the future of my life, and through this foundation, they will be a part of the future of this company's soul. If anyone on this board finds that objectionable, if you believe that compassion is a liability, then I will tender my resignation, effective immediately. The choice is yours. He stood there, defiant and vulnerable, having laid his entire empire on the line for a woman and a child he had met in a rainstorm. The silence stretched on, thick and heavy. No one dared to breathe. The fate of Arthur Vance and of Vance Innovations hung in the balance. The silence in the boardroom was absolute. It was a vacuum, holding the shocked expressions of the most powerful people in the company. They had come expecting to witness a corporate execution. Instead, they had been handed a lesson in humanity. They looked at Arthur, not the reclusive, grief-stricken CEO they had grown accustomed to, but a man reborn, filled with a purpose that transcended profit margins. They looked at Sarah, who stood by his side not as a victim, but as a figure of quiet strength and dignity. And they looked at Leo, the small boy who had unknowingly held the company's fate in his hands. It was Henderson, the old, gruff board member, who broke the spell. He slowly, deliberately, began to clap. It was a soft, rhythmic sound in the silent room. Then another board member joined in, and another, until the entire room, with the exception of a pale and sweating Marcus Thorne, was on its feet, giving Arthur a standing ovation. The tension shattered, replaced by a wave of emotion, of respect, of shame for their own cynical assumptions. They weren't just applauding a business decision. They were applauding an act of profound moral courage. Marcus Thorne tried to slip out of the room unnoticed, but Arthur's voice stopped him cold. "Marcus, your resignation will be on my desk by noon." There was no anger in his voice, only a final, dismissive finality. Marcus nodded numbly and fled. The media narrative, once a torrent of scandal, shifted course with the force of a tidal wave. The story of the homeless boy who saved the billionaire was irresistible. It was a modern fairy tale, a story of redemption and hope that the world was hungry for. News outlets that had vilified Sarah now hailed her as a symbol of integrity. Vance Innovations stock, after the announcement of the foundation, didn't just recover, it soared to an all-time high. Investors and the public alike responded overwhelmingly to a company that had found its heart. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of change. Sarah, with Arthur's unwavering support, embraced her new role as the head of the foundation with a quiet, fierce competence. She wasn't just a figurehead. She was its driving force, her experiences giving her a unique and powerful insight into the needs of the families they were helping. She traded the cold, impersonal corporate apartment for a warm, beautiful house in a quiet, tree-lined suburb. A home, not just a place to live. The sterile, white walls of Arthur's life were repainted in warm yellows and soft blues. The minimalist furniture was replaced with comfortable sofas and bookshelves overflowing with books. The silent halls of his penthouse were forgotten, replaced by the sound of Leo's laughter as he chased a puppy through the backyard. Photographs appeared on the mantelpiece. One of Eleanor and Thomas, given a place of honor. And next to it, a new one, Arthur, Sarah, and Leo, standing in the park, squinting in the sun, their arms around each other, a real, imperfect, and beautiful family. The transformation in Arthur was the most profound change of all. The hollow look in his eyes was gone, replaced by a warm, steady light. He still ran his company with vision and brilliance, but now he led with compassion. He learned to leave work at a reasonable hour. He learned how to make pancakes on a Saturday morning, how to help with homework, how to tuck a little boy into bed, and read him a story about a brave little star finding its way home. One evening, as the sun set, casting long shadows across their backyard, Arthur was pushing Leo on a swing set he had built himself. Sarah watched from the porch, a soft smile on her face. He was a different man from the one she had met in the rain. That man had been a ghost. This man was vibrantly, wonderfully alive. He caught her eye and smiled, a genuine, easy smile that reached his eyes. In that shared glance, a world of unspoken love and gratitude passed between them. They had found each other in the storm, two broken souls, and a little boy with the heart of a puzzle master. They had taken the shattered pieces of their lives, and, together, they had built something new, something whole, something called home. The story of Arthur, Sarah, and Leo isn't just a tale about a homeless boy solving a multi-million-dollar problem. It's a powerful reminder that the greatest poverty isn't a lack of money, but a lack of connection. It's about how the simplest act of kindness can unlock the most heavily guarded heart. Arthur Vance had all the wealth in the world, but his life was empty until he learned to see the person, not the circumstance. Sarah and Leo had nothing, but their richness of spirit was enough to save a man who had lost his way. Their journey teaches us that our true value is not measured by our bank accounts or our job titles, but by our capacity for love, our integrity, and the courage to open our hearts to one another. Every person we meet is fighting a battle we know nothing about, and sometimes the most profound solutions come from the most unexpected places. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to like this video and share it with someone who might need a little inspiration today. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming stories that remind us of the goodness in the world. Thank you for watching, and remember to always look for the humanity in everyone you meet.